Here's Dennis Prager to make excuses for the draconian punishments prescribed by the Bible.
Even atheists acknowledge that the book that's most responsible for creating Western civilization is the Bible.
I'm an atheist, and not only do I not acknowledge that, I don't think it even makes any sense given the fact that Western civilization began in pre-Christian Greece. Sure, the Bible influenced Western civilization after that civilization was initially created, but it is in no sense responsible for its creation. By the time Westerners started picking up the Bible, Western civilization already existed. In fact, given the fact that the New Testament was written in Greek and was influenced by Greek culture, Western civilization is more responsible for the creation of the Bible than the Bible is for the creation of Western civilization.
Until very recently, that was considered quite an achievement. After all, it was Western civilization that created societies rooted in individual liberty.
Which pro-life, anti-weed Dennis here doesn't actually believe in.
Rooted in democracy.
Which the Greeks practiced before they became Christian and is not endorsed anywhere in the Bible.
That affirmed the equality of all people.
Which is also not in the Bible, and is actually contradicted by its countenance of slavery. Also, the American founders, whom I'm sure Dennis venerates, only said that all men are equal, not all people. And they didn't even practice the principle of all men being equal. A lot of them owned slaves. And when Americans tried to pass an amendment affirming that women are equal to men, which would actually live up to the principle of all people being equal, the biggest resistance to this amendment came from Bible bangers like Phyllis Schlafly.
And which gave the world the notion of universal human rights.
Where is that in the Bible? Why is it that whenever a human right heretofore unenumerated in law gets explicitly acknowledged, it is usually the Bible enthusiasts who get upset about it?
Of course, these unique moral ideals took centuries to be realized, and the ideals were often violated.
Which is weird if these principles were supposedly contained in a document which was responsible for the whole civilization's existence.
But only the West formulated these ideals, let alone achieved them, and then spread them around the world. In the last half-century, however, many of the recipients of these gifts, especially the well-educated, no longer regarded Western civilization as morally superior to any other.
That's because well-educated people have read about how much violence has resulted from the idea of Western superiority. Even if you believe that the West is in some sense superior, it should be perfectly clear that the idea of Western superiority has been used as an excuse for an immense amount of brutality. Rudyard Kipling believed in what he called a white man's burden. He thought that it was the right thing to do to go to non-Western places and civilize them by force. This idea was used to justify everything from the massacre of Amritsar to bringing democracy to the Middle East.
And as reverence for Western civilization fell, so did reverence for the source of that civilization.
It's interesting how the source of Western civilization wasn't widely read in that civilization, or even fully written, until after that civilization already existed.
The Bible has not only been neglected, but reviled, as a foolish fairy tale at best, and as an immoral work at worst. This view springs not from intellectual rigor, but from intellectual laziness. People throw out all sorts of objections to the Bible as if there were no rational and moral responses to those objections. But the fact is, there are rational and moral responses to all those objections. I give many of them in my book, The Rational Bible, but let me offer two here. In the biblical book of Deuteronomy, it says, if someone has a rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother, his parents can take him to the elders of the city for judgment. And if the son is found guilty, the citizens are to stone him to death. Sounds pretty primitive, doesn't it? In fact, however, it was an enormous moral leap forward. This law ended forever parental ownership of their children, and with it, the right to kill them. The brilliance of this law was that it seemed to preserve the absolute authority of parents, but in fact, ended it.
So this was a moral advance because it left the killing of children up to the community elders rather than the parents? Wow, what an amazing leap forward in moral thought.
But you will respond, the citizens of the city could still kill the child. Theoretically, that was true, but we have no instance of it ever happening in the history of the Jews, the people who brought the book into the world and lived by its rules.
In other words, they didn't actually live by the justice system given by the book that we're all supposed to revere as the basis of the greatest civilization on the planet.
Critics of Western religion also often cite the famous biblical law, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, etc., as another example of an immoral biblical law.
My biggest problem with that law is not even that I find it to be immoral. What I find most troubling is many Bible enthusiasts seem to believe that after one is judged in the afterlife, it is totally abandoned. Rather than the implied proportionality of the lex talionis, once you die, your punishment, no matter the severity of your sins, is the same. Eternal torture. Instead of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, once you die, you get eternal torture for an eye and eternal torture for a tooth. The supposed fairness of an eye for an eye is not something for which God seems to have any regard when he sends all unrepentant sinners to hell.
But this law, known by its Latin name, lex talionis, the law of retaliation, was another great moral advance. It was not meant to be taken literally, and it never was, for the simple reason that it's impossible to exactly duplicate bodily harm. Only a life for a life was meant literally, and taken literally, there is capital punishment for premeditated murder. So then, what did it mean? For one thing, lex talionis is the ultimate statement of human equality. Every person's eye is as precious as anyone else's. The eye of a prince is worth no more than the eye of a peasant. This was completely new in history. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, for example, legislated that the eye of a noble was of much greater value than the eye of a commoner.
But it also specified an inequality, that is, that an eye is worth an eye and not a tooth. A tooth is worth a tooth and not an eye. All of this goes completely out the window, and damaging a tooth gets the same punishment as damaging an eye. Swearing at your mom gets the same punishment as a shooting spree.
Second, the principle of an eye for an eye ensured only the guilty party was punished for his crime.
I know Dennis is Jewish, so he doesn't have to square this with the Christian doctrine of penal substitution, but the fact that most of the West is Christian now, and thus believes in a religion significantly predicated on the idea that penal substitution is just, means that the idea that only the guilty are punished didn't take very firm hold of the West.
In other law codes and in common practice, if you killed someone's daughter, your daughter would be killed. That was expressly prohibited in the Bible and by the eye for an eye code.
I have a lot of trouble believing that nobody on the entire planet figured out that this was a problem until it was written in the Bible. Also, Dennis's whole defense of the Bible's prescribed brutality seems to be nothing but whataboutism. His argument is that the horrendous prescriptions in the Bible are actually good because there are other law codes from the time that were worse.
Now the killer would be punished, not the killer's daughter. Third, lex talionis prohibited unjust revenge.
Not in the afterlife, apparently.
In the ancient world, if a man gouged out another man's eye, the victim, if he could, would gouge out both the attacker's eyes, or kill him, or hurt his children, and so on. In contrast, eye for an eye ensured the victim receive appropriate compensation for the damages he suffered, but the punishment had to fit the crime.
That implies different punishments for different crimes, which does not apply in the afterlife if hell exists.
The next time you read or hear someone argue that the Bible is irrational or immoral, tell them how the stone the rebellious son law ended parental killing of children.
I really don't see how that justifies a law which endorses the communal killing of children. I know you said there's no record of that punishment being applied, but if it was that easy to keep people from executing children, why not just say, don't execute children? If no children were being executed by the community in the way the Bible prescribes, then a law against executing children altogether should have been pretty easy to follow.
And how the eye for an eye law struck a unique blow for human equality and justice. If they're intellectually honest, they'll admit that they have learned something new.
If they're intellectually honest, they'll point out that Dennis's argument is what's called a fallacy of relative privation. The fact that other laws of the time were worse in no way excuses the brutality of the laws the Bible prescribes. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.